generally. Like in Code of Silence I did in Chicago, I get jumped by a bunch of guys, and I lose. I get beat up real bad in that scene there because I thought there's 12 guys, there's no way that I can really take and win that fight.
Chuck Norris, the invincible symbol of Hollywood, actually carried within him far too many cracks. Audiences remember Chuck Norris through the legendary fight with Bruce Lee in The Way of the Dragon, the unyielding hero in Missing in Action, or the relentless lawman in Walker, Texas Ranger. On screen, he could defeat enemies with a single kick, but in real life, he collapsed under losses he could not fight. Few people know that before becoming the Superman in Walker, Texas Ranger, Norris was once a timid boy, trembling as he watched his father drunkenly smash things in their shabby home, witnessing his family fall apart, and being mocked by classmates until he couldn't even lift his head. And even when he stood at the peak of fame, he could not escape the crushing blows of fate. His only brother killed in Vietnam, a 3-decade marriage that fell apart, an out-of-wedlock daughter he only discovered when he was already a star, and finally, the deepest pain of all, watching his wife battle a mysterious illness that modern medicine could hardly treat. What kept Chuck Norris standing? How could someone once so weak, knocked down in mere seconds, transform into a legend admired worldwide? At 85, Chuck Norris is no longer the superhero of the screen, but a man who has learned to rise after being shattered. His story is not just about becoming a martial arts icon. It is living proof that true strength lies in willpower and perseverance in life. Chuck Norris was born on March 10, 1940, in the small town of Ryan, Oklahoma. He was the eldest of 3 sons of Ray Norris and Wilma Scarberry. It was an unhappy family, and Chuck's early years were quickly overshadowed by instability. His father, Ray, had served as a soldier in World War II, but instead of returning in glory, he came back with invisible wounds. Ray fell into alcoholism, was often unemployed, and took out his violence on the family. Long drinking binges, sudden disappearances without explanation. These became the backdrop of Chuck's childhood, filled with confusion and fear. His mother, Wilma, was the opposite, a small, devout, and resilient woman. She practically raised the 3 boys alone, pinching every penny just to survive. Chuck would often recall nights when his mother prayed through tears, as if faith was the only thing keeping her standing. In the eyes of others, young Chuck was a frail, timid boy who struggled in school. He stuttered, was poor at sports, and kept his head down out of shame. At school, he became an easy target for ridicule. He often ate lunch alone, sitting quietly in a corner to avoid attention. Once, a local police officer even humiliated him in front of a girl he liked, a memory that left a scar he never forgot. Even at home, Chuck could not find safety. He and his brothers often had to flee when their father came home drunk. At just 14, Chuck once stood between his mother and his staggering father, clutching a hammer in his hands, ready to protect her from being beaten. That feeling of helplessness carved itself deep into his mind, planting the seed of a silent vow. One day, he would be strong enough so that no one could ever hurt his family again. When his father abandoned them, leaving 3 children to a single mother, Wilma made the decision to leave Oklahoma and take her sons to Torrance, California, in search of a new beginning. But even in that promised land, the Norris family could not escape poverty. Chuck worked every odd job he could find, delivering newspapers at dawn, shining shoes on the street, helping on farms, cleaning grocery stores. The meager wages didn't make him feel grown up, but at least they gave him the sense that he was helping to carry the family's burden. Behind all the shyness, insecurity, and quiet pain, Chuck Norris held on to a secret. Each night, before drifting into sleep, he repeated to himself a single promise. One day, he would no longer be the weak boy everyone dismissed. One day, he would be strong enough to change his fate, to protect his mother and brothers, to break free from the dark shadow of the alcoholic father that haunted his childhood. That promise, known to no one but himself, was the ember that drove Chuck Norris into the military, into martial arts, and eventually transformed him into the indomitable symbol of American culture. Those years seemed destined to bury Chuck's life in a vicious cycle of poverty and shame. But then a turning point came when he decided to enlist in the military. In 1958, at just 18 years old, Chuck Norris put on the uniform of the United States Air Force. He was assigned as an air policeman and stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea. For a boy who had never left the poor lands of Oklahoma, this journey opened an entirely new world. The bustling streets, unfamiliar customs, and foreign language made Chuck feel both excited and lost. The locals nicknamed him Chuckles, unable to pronounce Carlos Ray properly, while his superiors shortened it to Chuck, a simple, strong name that would forever be tied to the legend he was about to build. But military life was no red carpet. Chuck carried all his childhood shyness and insecurities into a world of rigid discipline, where physical strength was the measure of a man. The first time he stepped onto a judo mat in front of his fellow airmen, he was thrown down by a smaller opponent in just 12 seconds. The humiliation hit him like a slap, reviving the weakness of his past. Yet instead of giving up, Chuck realized this was his chance to change his destiny. If he didn't learn how to fight, he would forever remain the boy who was looked down on. From then on, he turned to Tang Soo Do, a traditional Korean martial art, under the guidance of Master Kim. Training was grueling. Military duties by day, sweat on the wooden floor by night. Every move, every kick was not just physical practice, but a way to shatter pieces of insecurity that had weighed on him since childhood. He trained until his limbs were bruised, collapsing again and again, only to rise each time. It was in Korea that Chuck, for the first time, felt himself slowly mastering fear, slowly learning to lift his head high like a real man. When he returned to the U.S. after his service, he did not stop at Tang Soo Do. Chuck went on to study Shotokan and Chito-ryu karate from Japan, Kenpo from Hawaii, and even returned to judo, the very art that had once humiliated him. He absorbed it all, gradually blending techniques into what became American Tang Soo Do, the foundation of his legendary martial arts career. In 1962, after 4 years stationed in Korea, Chuck Norris was honorably discharged with the rank of Airman First Class. He returned to America with a clear plan: to apply for the police force, hoping for a steady job to support his young family with his wife, Diane Holcheck. Yet while waiting for the application process, Chuck made what seemed like a reckless decision. He opened his first dojo. It was nothing more than a small rented room in Torrance, California, no flashy signboard, no crowd of students. By day, Chuck worked at Northrop Aviation, an aircraft manufacturing plant, to pay the bills. At night, he hurriedly exchanged his work uniform for a white GI, waiting inside the dojo with only a few worn mats and a handful of students. Some evenings, only 2 or 3 pupils would show up, and the combined tuition barely covered the rent. Many advised him to quit, saying opening a dojo under such conditions was nothing but a fantasy. But Chuck didn't listen. Unlike the boy who once bowed his head and ran from mockery, this time he refused to retreat. He treated that tiny dojo as the place where he would rebuild his life. Every drill, every technique he taught wasn't only for his students. It was also his way of reminding himself, you are no longer that timid child. This is your new path. From that modest dojo in Torrance, Chuck began entering semi-professional and then professional karate tournaments, arenas that gathered the fiercest fighters in America at the time. He stepped onto the mats with little more than his Tang Soo Do background and a belief that he could make it. But the reality was brutal. Chuck was beaten again and again, quickly becoming a familiar name on the losing side. Joe Louis, who would later be crowned the king of kickboxing, defeated him with ease. Alan Steen, a Texas powerhouse, left Norris struggling so badly he could barely mount an attack. Worst of all were his clashes with Tony Tulliners. 3 matches, 3 losses. Then came John Camozzi, who eliminated him in the opening round, rendering all of Chuck's preparation meaningless in just a few short minutes. In the stands, fans grew accustomed to seeing Norris leave the ring with disappointment etched across his face. Within the martial arts community, he was considered little more than a stepping stone, a fighter without the grit to surprise anyone. But it was in these humiliating moments that Chuck began to change. Each defeat became less of an ending and more of a mirror. He asked himself, where did I go wrong? Where was I weak? Returning from tournaments while other fighters rested, Chuck pushed himself relentlessly on the training mats. He dissected every strike, repeated drills until his muscles burned, until sweat soaked the canvas. Once, he had run from mockery. Now he confronted it head-on. He set new limits for himself, training twice, even 3 times harder, building stamina and speed, refusing to give himself a single day off. Every punch, every spinning kick wasn't only aimed at an imagined opponent. It was aimed at the ghosts of his past, the timid boy who ate lunch alone at school, the teenager trembling with a hammer in hand before his drunken father. On the mats, Chuck Norris wasn't just learning to defeat others. He was learning to defeat the fear that had haunted him since childhood. The true turning point came in the summer of 1967, when Chuck had grown weary of being dismissed. On June 3rd, at a major karate tournament in California, he stepped into the ring with nothing left to lose. Over the course of one day, Chuck faced 7 formidable opponents. In the past, just 2 or 3 matches would exhaust him. But this time, his relentless training and the steel will forged in failure transformed him. Match after match, Chuck fought calmly, patiently, landing precise strikes. By the final bout, when his hand was raised in victory, he could hardly believe he had overcome 7 straight challengers. For the first time, he saw respect in the eyes of the crowd, the respect he had craved since boyhood. Barely weeks later, on June 24th, he tested himself again at the All-American Karate Championship, one of the most prestigious tournaments in the country, held at Madison Square Garden, the Cathedral of Sport in New York. The road to the finals was grueling. Chuck defeated Julio LaSalle, Vic Moore, Skipper Mullins, and Steve Sanders, names that had once tormented him. Each win was a sweet revenge against years of humiliation. In the final, his opponent was none other than Joe Louis, the legend who had once crushed him. The match was tense, the crowd roaring with every exchange. But this time, Chuck Norris was no longer the raw novice. With the sharp focus and speed forged from thousands of hours of practice, he triumphed. When Joe Louis fell and the announcer declared Chuck Norris the winner, Madison Square Garden had no choice but to recognize it. The perpetual loser had become a champion. From that guy who always lost, Chuck suddenly became a phenomenon, a name that forced the American martial arts scene to take notice. But fate wasn't done testing him. In 1968, Chuck faced Louis Delgado and lost. It was the 10th defeat of his career, a number that seemed to brand him as nothing more than a fighter skilled only in failure. For most, it would have been the end. For Chuck, it wasn't. He refused to be defined by a number. On November 24th, that same year, at another major tournament, he faced Delgado again. Gone was the hesitation. Gone was the panic. Chuck fought like a man reborn. Every kick, every punch carried the conviction that this was his final turning point. And he did it. Chuck Norris defeated Louis Delgado and claimed the title of professional middleweight karate champion. That belt was more than a symbol of victory. It was his declaration that the era of defeat was over. From 1968 to 1974, Chuck held the championship for 6 consecutive years, collecting a string of national and international titles. He didn't just reverse his own fate. He cemented his place as one of America's greatest karate fighters. This was the bedrock upon which Chuck would take his next step into the bright lights of Hollywood. But trophies and titles weren't enough. Chuck wanted more than to be remembered as a temporary champion. He wanted to build something lasting, an institution others could learn from, inherit, and expand. In 1973, he founded the National Tang Soo Do Congress, the first organization uniting his students and followers of the martial philosophy he had brought from Korea. 6 years later, in 1979, he established the United Fighting Arts Federation, UFAF, a larger, more structured international body. It was the foundation of his lifelong ambition to create a martial arts legacy of his own. From this foundation came the development of Chun Kuk Do, literally, the universal way. This style wasn't a copy of any single tradition. It was a synthesis of everything Chuck had studied: the discipline of Tang Soo Do, the strategy of Shotokan, the speed of Kenpo, and the control of Judo. It was not only martial arts, but a philosophy. Train the body, discipline the self, live with integrity. By 2015, it was officially renamed the Chuck Norris System, cementing his personal stamp on the art. From those first classes with only a handful of students, Chuck patiently trained each one. Over time, he produced more than 300 black belts, built a team that remained undefeated in 29 consecutive tournaments. A record almost unmatched in American martial arts. And it wasn't just fighters. Celebrities and entertainers sought him out. Steve McQueen, who later urged Chuck to try acting, Bob Barker, Priscilla Presley, and Donnie and Marie Osmond. They came not only for technique, but for the discipline, confidence, and inner strength he inspired. Martial arts gave Chuck Norris more than glory. It saved him from shame, from the shadow of fear, and transformed a once timid boy into an indomitable figure. By then, firmly established in the martial arts world, Chuck was ready to walk through the next door, the door of Hollywood, where a fateful encounter with Bruce Lee would open an entirely new chapter in his life. Once he had secured his place in the martial arts world, Chuck began to attract attention not only from fighters, but also from Hollywood, which, in the 1970s, was hungry for fresh action stars. The turning point came when he befriended Steve McQueen, the celebrated actor and also one of his students. McQueen urged Chuck to try acting, convinced that his discipline and commanding presence could win over audiences. At first, Chuck Norris only appeared sporadically in low-budget martial arts films, usually in brief roles as an instructor, a secondary fighter, or even working as a fight choreographer behind the scenes. He never imagined he would one day stand alongside major stars. But everything changed in 1972, when Bruce Lee, his friend and sparring partner, approached him with an unexpected proposal. By then, Bruce had already become a global sensation after The Big Boss and Fist of Fury. Preparing for the Way of the Dragon, he needed a climactic battle to define his image as the undefeated dragon. The chosen stage was none other than the Colosseum in Rome, the legendary arena of the Roman Empire. Bruce required an opponent who could match him in skill and presence, someone the audience would believe as a worthy equal. The first name he thought of was Chuck Norris, with whom he had trained and shared long conversations about martial philosophy. Chuck hesitated at first. He had never taken on a major role, had little experience in front of the camera, and could hardly imagine the weight of starring in a Bruce Lee film. But Bruce's persuasion and the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity won him over. The decision would change the course of his career forever. Filming at the Colosseum was under strict conditions. The crew was given only a limited time inside the historic arena. The nearly 10-minute fight, unprecedented in martial arts cinema at the time, had to be meticulously choreographed. Bruce and Chuck worked together to map out every detail, each punch, each kick, and even the precise moment of defeat. They wanted the duel to be more than a showcase of skills. It was to be a symbolic clash of styles, Bruce's speed, agility, and creativity against Chuck's power, discipline, and solidity. The result was a fight scene etched into cinema history. Bruce moved like a panther, swift, precise, untouchable. Chuck stood firm, striking like a wall of force, each blow heavy and destructive. The contrast created a rhythm both gripping and tense. And then came the unscripted detail. Bruce ripping open Chuck's shirt and pulling out a handful of his real chest hair, left in the final cut to heighten the scene's realism. It shocked and thrilled audiences worldwide. When The Way of the Dragon premiered, the Colosseum battle was instantly hailed as one of the greatest martial arts sequences ever filmed. The movie shattered box office records in Hong Kong and grossed the equivalent of over $130 million worldwide, an unprecedented feat for Asian cinema at the time. It was also the first film from Hollywood and Hong Kong to be shot inside the Colosseum, cementing the duel as a cultural landmark. For Bruce, it was the ultimate proof of his dragon persona. For Chuck, it was the moment millions around the world first recognized his face, not just as a karate champion, but as a rising action star. That scene didn't just mark a new chapter in Chuck Norris's career. It carried him from the cramped dojo into the dazzling light of Hollywood. Following the global success of The Way of the Dragon, Chuck stepped into Hollywood on his own terms. By the late 1970s, he began carving out a distinct identity. Breaker. 1977 was his first leading role, a low-budget action film that unexpectedly became a box office success, proving he could carry a movie without Bruce Lee's shadow. But it was Good Guys Wear Black, 1978, that truly established him. As John T. Booker, a betrayed government operative, Chuck delivered a performance that resonated with audiences and solidified his place in American action cinema. Entering the 1980s, Chuck Norris hit his golden era. He headlined a string of films that captured the American spirit, Lone Wolf McQuade, 1983, portrayed him as a rebellious yet justice-driven cop. Missing in Action, 1984, tapped into the raw wounds of the Vietnam War, with Chuck as a former POW returning to rescue abandoned comrades. His image as the American hero, willing to confront corrupt systems and invisible enemies, was reinforced in The Delta Force, 1986, where he played an anti-terrorism commando embodying the global fears of the time. These films not only triumphed commercially, but also turned Chuck Norris into a symbol of rugged strength, patriotism, and justice. He didn't stop at the big screen. Chuck exploded onto television with Walker, Texas Ranger, 1993 to 2001. For nearly a decade, the series became a worldwide phenomenon, airing in more than 100 countries. The character of Cordell Walker, a principled Texas lawman, tough yet fair, disciplined yet compassionate, etched itself into popular memory. With Walker, Texas Ranger, Chuck Norris wasn't just an action star. He became a family hero, someone parents and children alike could watch together each evening. Through his straightforward but earnest acting, combined with unmatched martial arts skill, Chuck Norris rose to the ranks of Hollywood's leading action icons, standing alongside Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yet unlike them, Chuck brought something different, less flamboyance, but an enduring image of discipline, honor, and justice. The very qualities forged from the painful struggles of his youth. On screen, Chuck Norris was the very face of American heroism. Films like Missing in Action and The Delta Force turned him into the embodiment of the indestructible soldier, the man who never fell. Yet even as audiences cheered for the image of the uniformed hero, Chuck was quietly living with a private grief that never healed. In 1970, his younger brother Weiland, only 21 at the time, enlisted and was sent to the Vietnam War. During a fierce battle, Weiland led the charge. Took a fatal bullet, but still managed to shout a warning that saved his squad from an ambush. He died on the spot. For Chuck, it was not just the loss of a brother, but a spiritual wound that would never close. From that day on, every time he put on a uniform for a movie role, he was haunted by Weiland's image. The battle scenes filled with gunfire and smoke were not simply fiction. They were living memories, a private ritual of remembrance only he could understand. 2 decades later, tragedy struck again in another form. In 1991, Lee Atwater, the powerful political strategist and Chuck's closest friend, was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. Within a short time, Atwater's health collapsed and he died at the age of 40. His passing shook Chuck to the core. If someone as strong as Atwater could be taken down so quickly, then even he himself was not invincible. From that moment, Chuck became deeply aware of life's fragility. These wounds, the brother lost in youth, the friend lost in midlife, silently shaped the way Chuck approached family and marriage. To him, family was not only a source of comfort, but a responsibility, a way to make up for the irreparable losses he had suffered. Yet even within the walls of what seemed like a steadfast home, Chuck could not entirely escape heartbreak. The blows of fate only made Chuck cling tighter to family as his refuge. He believed that marriage and a home of his own were the only things that could fill the void Weiland had left behind. In 1958, at just 18 years old, Chuck married his high school sweetheart, Diane Holcheck. The wedding was simple, without luxury, attended only by close friends. But for the young man just back from military service, it was a promise of the stability he had longed for. They began their marriage with nothing, living in a tiny apartment where Chuck worked odd jobs while running a small dojo with just a handful of students. Diane never complained. She trusted him and quietly shared every hardship. In those early years, the couple lived so frugally that at times they had to scrape together coins just to get by. Yet they stayed close, because in Chuck's eyes, Diane was the only steady anchor in a life full of turmoil. As Chuck entered the world of professional karate and then began to rise with decisive victories, Diane remained in the background, keeping the home fires burning. Their two sons, Mike and Eric, grew up largely in their mother's care, while their father was often absent, first for tournaments, then to open new schools, and later because of grueling film schedules. But glory always carries a price. Once Chuck found success in Hollywood, his absences stretched from weeks to months, endless filming, promotional tours, and the temptations of show business. Diane tried to endure, holding the family together, but the distance between them grew wider. Chuck returned home in triumph, but inside the small kitchen, the silence of his wife and the loneliness of his children could not be erased by movie tickets or red carpet photos. Worse still, a belated truth deepened the cracks. During his early military years, Chuck had a brief relationship that resulted in a daughter out of wedlock, Dina, born in 1962. For decades, he had no idea she existed. It was only after his divorce that Dina came forward. Her existence forced Chuck to confront his own past mistakes, and for Diane, it was a wound that could never truly heal. In 1988, after more than 30 years together, Chuck and Diane divorced. Behind that farewell was an emptiness impossible to fill. A woman who had devoted her youth to standing in the shadows, only to find she could not preserve the home she fought for. And an action star who had defeated countless enemies on screen, yet came to realize he had lost completely in the battle to save his own family. Chuck would later admit bitterly, "That was one of the greatest failures of my life. Not in the ring or on set, but within the walls of his own home." After the shock of divorce, Chuck entered middle age as a man who seemed to have lost faith in love. Yet fate had other plans when he met Gina O'Kelly, a former model, 23 years his junior, who had already gone through one marriage and was raising 2 children of her own. They met at a gathering of friends where Gina's gaze did not linger on the martial arts star, but saw instead a man carrying deep wounds in his heart. That honesty and simplicity shook Chuck to his core. In 1998, the two were married. The wedding was not a Hollywood spectacle, but for Chuck, it marked a new beginning, a chance to rebuild himself. After all the fractures of the past, this time he resolved to be a husband who listened, a father in the truest sense. In 2001, when their twins, Dakota and Dana-Lee, were born, Chuck was already 61 years old, but holding his children in his arms made him feel young again. He deliberately cut back on film projects, spending more time at the Lone Wolf Ranch in Texas, living at a slower pace and treasuring every moment with his family. In the early years of marriage, the Norris household resembled the perfect picture Chuck had once dreamed of in his days of poverty. The man who had once stormed across screens became a simple father at home, driving the kids to school in the morning, mowing the vast lawns at Lone Wolf Ranch at midday, playing ball with Dakota and Dana-Lee in the afternoon, and sitting at the dinner table in the evening listening to Gina recount her day. To millions of fans, he was still the invincible hero. But in the eyes of Gina and the children, he was only a gentle husband and father. For Chuck, these were the happiest years of his life, a quiet happiness that no amount of fame could ever give him. But fate never truly let him go. In July 2013, disaster struck after what should have been a routine MRI scan. This time, Gina was injected with gadolinium-based contrast dye used to sharpen medical images. Instead of recovering, her body began to collapse with strange symptoms: tremors, numbness in her limbs, slurred speech, constant pain. The rare condition was later identified as gadolinium deposition disease. The months that followed were a relentless nightmare. Gina was rushed to emergency rooms repeatedly, hospitalized for weeks at a time. Once a vibrant, energetic woman, she became bedridden, trapped in a body that betrayed her. Chuck Norris, the man who had never known the word defeat on screen, could only sit helplessly at her bedside, whispering in despair, "She's dying right before my eyes." To save his wife, Chuck stepped out of the spotlight, abandoning his career. He spent nearly $2 million on treatments, from the US to Europe, even flying to China to try stem cell therapy. All the glory, all the projects, everything was left behind. His sole purpose became winning back Gina's life. The couple also filed a $10 million lawsuit against pharmaceutical companies producing the contrast agents. Although they later withdrew the case without settlement, the legal battle carried a different meaning. It raised public awareness about the hidden dangers of gadolinium, something that had stolen Gina's health and youth. From movie star, Chuck became the steadfast partner sitting night after night at his wife's side, holding her hand through every wave of pain. The sight stunned the public. The invincible Superman, now gaunt, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights, yet unwavering in his care. In that despair, he realized true strength did not lie in his legendary spinning kicks, but in the ability to love and endure alongside the person he cherished most. For Chuck, his love with Gina became the most beautiful yet tragic chapter of his life. A safe harbor, but also the stage for his hardest battle, not against any enemy, but against fate itself. After the family crisis, Chuck Norris nearly withdrew from Hollywood to devote himself to his wife. Yet, he never vanished from public life. Since the late 1970s, Norris had made his conservative stance clear and tied himself closely to the Republican Party. He openly supported Ronald Reagan and later George H.W. Bush, appeared at campaign rallies, and built an image as the American hero inseparable from conservative ideals. In 2007, at the age of 67, Norris even traveled to Iraq to visit U.S. troops, bringing encouragement and morale to soldiers on the front lines. Beyond appearances, he also became a regular columnist for World Net Daily, where he spoke out on politics, morality, and faith. However, these strong views made Chuck Norris a controversial figure. In 2008, he openly endorsed Proposition 8, the California ballot measure banning same-sex marriage, drawing heavy criticism from the LGBTQ+ community. In 2009, he echoed the birther theory, questioning whether Barack Obama was truly born in the United States. In 2011, he published a 5-part series warning about the supposed infiltration of Sharia law into America, igniting further debate. In 2012, Norris again stirred outrage when he wrote against the Boy Scouts of America's decision to allow gay members and released a video urging voters to block Obama's re-election with the dire warning of 1,000 years of darkness. During the 2016 election cycle, rumors spread that he supported Ted Cruz, but Norris clarified that he would wait to see who the final GOP candidate was before deciding. In 2017, he publicly endorsed Roy Moore, the Alabama Republican accused of sexual misconduct with underage girls, once again drawing intense backlash. Even past his peak stardom, Chuck Norris continued to appear in commercial ventures that sparked controversy. In 2019, he signed a deal to promote Glock firearms, a move widely condemned as pouring gasoline on the fire amid America's fierce gun violence debate. In 2021, he again divided public opinion by supporting the recall campaign against Governor Gavin Newsom, siding with Republican candidate Larry Elder. From a beloved action star admired by millions, Chuck Norris gradually transformed into a political and social figure of influence, one who carried the image of the American hero beyond the screen, but at the cost of bitter division in how the public perceived him. In his 80s, Chuck Norris is no longer the action star who once dominated the big screen, but he still holds a unique place in popular culture. After decades under the bright lights, he has chosen a quieter rhythm of life at Lone Wolf Ranch in Texas, a sprawling estate with a private lake, a dojo, and even a bottling plant producing the family-run Sea-Force water brand. For Chuck, it is both a sanctuary and a museum of memories after a lifetime of upheaval. His days now follow a simple routine. Waking early with his wife, Gina O'Kelly, doing light exercise to stay fit, training a few close students, and occasionally joining community activities. Chuck has almost completely stepped away from Hollywood to devote himself to caring for Gina, who has battled severe health complications since an MRI procedure in 2013. For him, that remains the toughest fight of his life, and he has chosen to stand fully by her side instead of chasing fame. Even so, Chuck Norris has never disappeared from the public eye. In 2024, he made a surprising return to the screen in Agent Recon as Captain Alistair. In 2025, he followed with Zombie Plane, an action comedy project that proved at 85 he still wanted to test himself in the arts. Alongside film, Chuck astonished many by keeping up his boxing, weightlifting, and martial arts training. Images of his workouts spreading widely on social media as proof of his iron will. His private life also highlights the contrast with his invincible on-screen persona. In 2024, Chuck shared the painful news of his mother, Wilma, passing away at the age of 103, leaving a deep void in his heart. That same year, he and Gina marked their 26th wedding anniversary, celebrating a long journey that had seen no shortage of challenges. From time to time, he is spotted quietly at local diners, smiling warmly, a far cry from the stoic hero of his prime. Today, Chuck Norris's strength is no longer found in the spinning kicks that made him legendary, but in his patience, his love, and his ability to remain standing after life's storms. He is still cherished, not only by fans who once adored Walker, Texas Ranger, or his action films of the 1980s, but also by those who see in him a man unafraid to slow down, to face his own limits, and to choose family as his final anchor. Even in his quiet life at Lone Wolf Ranch, the image of Chuck Norris has never faded from public memory. His name is tied not only to an octogenarian caring for his ailing wife, but also to the legacy of an entire generation. The spinning kicks, the heroic roles, and the private stories of loss and endurance have blended together, making him a part of American cultural memory. The legacy Chuck Norris leaves behind is not just in blockbuster action films or the spinning kick that became his trademark. He turned his entire life into a symbol, a piece of American cultural history. In martial arts, Chuck was not only a 6-time karate champion, but also the founder of Chun Kook Do, training hundreds of black belts and instilling the belief that martial arts were not only about winning fights, but about discipline and character. His students even included Hollywood names like Steve McQueen and Priscilla Presley, proof that his influence extended far beyond the dojo. In cinema, Chuck Norris was part of the wave of American heroes of the 1980s, standing alongside Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, yet distinguished by his simplicity and integrity. Films like Missing in Action, The Delta Force, and the long-running Walker, Texas Ranger etched into memory the image of a hero who did not boast, but used strength only to defend justice. His legendary fight with Bruce Lee in The Way of the Dragon remains one of the greatest combat scenes in film history, elevating both men to global icon status. In public life, Chuck Norris also left a mark with philanthropy. His foundation, Kickstart Kids, has helped tens of thousands of American children learn martial arts, build discipline, and steer clear of drugs. He has also actively supported veterans, disadvantaged children, and community projects both in the U.S. and abroad. These contributions showed that he was not only an action star, but a devoted citizen. On another level, Chuck Norris entered the digital age through the phenomenon of Chuck Norris Facts, a collection of exaggerated jokes about his superhuman strength that spread across the internet in the mid-2000s. Though they began as satire, Chuck wisely embraced them, turning the jokes into part of his brand and ensuring his image remained immortal in online culture. One could say Chuck Norris's legacy is a fusion of reality and legend. He is living proof that a timid, fragile boy can grow into a global icon, not just through physical strength, but through determination and the will to rise above. What people remember most about Chuck Norris is not just the kicks or the legendary films, but the figure of a man who endured loss, stumbled, and still chose to stand again. He showed that true strength is not about being invincible, but about admitting wounds and continuing to live with all the love that remains. And perhaps that is why Chuck Norris's image has never disappeared, because we do not only see a screen legend, but also see ourselves reflected in the frailty and the longing to rise once more. And you? When you think of Chuck Norris, what comes to mind first? The indomitable hero on screen, or the flesh and blood man who has borne so many scars off it? Share your thoughts below. We would truly love to hear them.